Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Ask an Addiction Specialist. I'm Bob Weathers, and I'm happy to have you with us this week. I want to give credit to Austin Armstrong and Franz Salvatierra, my two co-producers here in the studio, and really happy to be meeting with you. So thanks for joining. Just as a quick recap, last week in our podcast, we discussed unstressing for the holidays. The idea being here is that the holidays can be stressful, and that there's ways that we can calm ourselves, including in a daily practice such as what we talked about last week, which was a sensory-focused meditation practice. That can be a good thing. Anything that can help manage our stress or reduce it during the holidays is gold. So that was our presentation last week, and we discussed in that presentation how it is that stress for anybody who's struggling with addiction and intending for recovery, stress is the number one trigger for relapse. And so the goal last week was to teach some self-regulation techniques, such as focusing in on our breath or focusing in on our senses, to help to center and ground us and to calm us. In that same spirit, I want to come back to looking at ways of reducing stress today. And today we're going to be talking about how it is that in order to reduce stress, we need to know how to mend ruptures in relationships. And why do I mention that on the cusp of the holidays? I think it was attributed to the integral theorist Ken Wilber. He said, if you feel so enlightened, just go home for the holidays. The holidays tend to be a strange attractor for stress. In fact, I just led a group this afternoon at Beginnings Treatment Center where one of the participants in the groups said, why are relationships so dadgum difficult? And I said, can I give you my brief elevator speech in response to that? And it went something like this, is that relationships are so stressful, particularly intimate relationships with loved ones, because if you think about it, our expectations and our skills are laid down in the form of blueprints in our earliest psychological development. And if we've experienced any wounding or misattunement early on, that tends to stick with us, but it tends only to crop up in our most intimate relationships. In fact, I gave the example, I was recently at a bookstore, and it's very unlikely that dealing with the bookstore attendant that there'd be much likelihood of friction coming out. Whereas with my most intimate relationships with loved ones, family and friends, there's much more likelihood that those early templates or blueprints will rise to the surface. Hence, our intimate relationships can be challenging. And so back to Ken Wilber, if you think you're so enlightened, just go home for the holidays. How do we deal with the inevitable bumps and grinds of holiday interactions with family and friends? And in that spirit, then today, we'll be focusing on one element of how we can mend these ruptures in relationships. I think of them as inadvertently stepping on one another's toes. And we'll be talking about how to say you're sorry. Another way to frame this, especially for those of you that have participated in the 12-step programs, is how to make amends effectively. We'll be looking at this in some detail today, and I'm glad you've joined in. Get a pencil or a pen and a piece of paper because we'll be doing some exercises shortly, but I'll introduce first of all the topic, and then we'll engage in some practical applications, okay? In the last few weeks, we've been talking about forgiveness, different ways of addressing forgiveness internally, as well as forgiveness and reconciliation in relationships. And in that context, I quoted the Christian theologian C.S. Lewis, who said this, everyone says forgiveness is a lovely idea until they have something to forgive. Everyone says that forgiveness is a lovely idea until they have something to forgive. I'd like to add a little nuance to that today. And so today's version would be, everyone says that forgiveness is a lovely idea, that is, until they have something for which they must apologize. And that gets us into the topic for the day. I also introduced in our previous conversations the work of Everett Worthington, a U.S. psychologist who's done as much work on the topic of forgiveness, specifically the psychology of forgiveness, as anybody on the planet. Dr. Worthington makes a distinction, as you'll recall, between decisional and emotional forgiveness. And if we apply this to saying we're sorry, to apology, is that it's possible for apology for there to be a transaction that includes an I'm sorry and that it not be effective. which is to say, I can decide to apologize or I can decide to forgive you for apologizing, but if that apology is anemic, or what I'll be talking about a little bit later today as a token apology, in other words, it's not sufficient, then I'm really left with only a decisional forgiveness in which I'm deciding to forgive you. The problem with the decisional forgiveness is it's more of an intellectual left-brained activity. And the emotional center of the brain, as it's routed through the right brain, won't nearly be satisfied. And so without a full-bodied emotional forgiveness, we're left building resentments in relationships that are sure to manifest, if not directly, then indirectly. These unhealed ruptures in relationship tend to be triggered in our most significant relationships, like I mentioned. And this is what attachment theory in psychology refers to as our attachment needs. As those arise in relationship, any kinds of unresolved resentments, wrongs done that were ineffectively apologized for, where there hasn't been forgiveness and reconciliation, these will tend to arise, and they'll result in a couple of different, very predictable responses, and these aren't mutually exclusive. If I dismiss the responsibility for forgiveness in a relationship, when the attachment longings, the desire to be close comes up, it may manifest as my being unusually emotionally activated, so increased reactivity on the one hand, and on the other hand, there may be a wall that comes up where I increase my distance. And these can actually coexist. There can be an oscillation between attack out of reactivity and then distancing or removal, the wall coming up as a response to unhealed or unfinished business. We also introduced in our last few conversations the work of current or contemporary attachment theorists in psychology. And near the top of the list is Dr. Susan Johnson out of Ottawa, who's done a tremendous amount of research looking at what happens in relationships that injures attachment and what can be done to heal and mend the ruptures that come up inevitably in relationship. She refers to her approach to therapy as emotionally focused therapy, and that gives you a sense very much in sync with what we just talked about with Everett Worthington, that for therapy to be effective, particularly in terms of mending breaks or ruptures in a relationship, it's going to require a deeper level of engagement emotionally. In other words, that making relationships right isn't just an intellectual issue of assenting to something. It's actually an emotionally embodied response to the other that can actually move towards reconciliation. So she talks about attachment injuries coming up in relationship or relationship ruptures in this way. She says that almost always, I'm going to use the analogy of stepping on someone's toe. Let's say that you offend somebody by accidentally stepping on their toe. There's that injury, but the greater injury is the inability most often to keep the other person, the injured party's feelings or their perspective in mind in terms of what really matters to them. And so we tend to injure one another, most often unintentionally, and then we don't know how to be with the other person's distress in a way that could move towards healing. So the question today that I want to ask you and ask ourselves is, what are the basic ingredients for an effective apology? I'm going to break it down into 6 different components. These are all laid out in the work of Susan Johnson. I recommend you to her books. Her 2 most recent books that are written for a popular or lay audience are Hold Me Tight and also Love Sense. And both of these books summarize decades of research that she's written up in a number of other volumes that are much more technical, intended for clinicians. But these latter 2 that I mentioned to you are easily accessible and chock full of research and the implications for healing and mending relationships. So I highly recommend those books. So what are the basic ingredients for an effective apology? That's what we're going to work through today. We're going to start by a series of exercises, so let me set the stage for this, and then we'll dive right in. What I'd like you to do on a piece of paper is to start by journaling an example. Just write out in a sentence or two an example where you recently wronged another person. So give yourself just a minute to focus on some way that you've wronged another person. It can be helpful if you pick something more recently because it still may be more alive in your memory, both in terms of thoughts but also feelings. As we're moving through these 6 elements of effectively making amends, I'm going to ask for you to note 2 things. One is that with the example that you've written about here, as we go through each of these steps or stages of an effective apology, I'm going to ask you to make note of challenges that arise with that particular stage or step, and also the possible benefits of being able to execute that step well. And I'll remind you of this as we go along. So that's the setting. I want you to write down, it's helpful to concretize this and write this out. I'd like you to write down a situation or circumstance where you wronged somebody. And then we're going to take you through the interior specifics of saying you're sorry. Okay, what I'm calling ingredient number 1. Ingredient number 1 in saying you're sorry, or creating an effective bridge or an apology, is to communicate caring for the individual that you've hurt. I just brought this up today to the group that I mentioned earlier here locally at the treatment center. And one of the individuals in the group said this. He said, I think that most often that's communicated in our body language. And I agree with him. In fact, what I told him is that communication theorists inform us that 90% of our communication with one another is primarily in body language. It's nonverbal. Sometimes that's referred to as paraverbal communication. Para means alongside of verbal, so everything besides the verbal content. And 90% of our communication is carried by that nonverbal or paraverbal component. That leaves just 10% to the actual semantic content of what we're verbalizing with one another. Kind of keeps things in perspective. And as I responded also to him, it's very hard to fake this. And it's also very hard for our instincts to miss it in a communication. We may not be aware of our body's response to somebody else's communication, but if we just take a step back and pay attention to that, oftentimes it's informing. In fact, what I said is it's easy to lie with words or distort things with words. It's much harder to lie. Our bodies really tell the truth most often in terms of nonverbal communication. So in terms of this first ingredient, I want you to pause for just a second and think back to this example that you've written down. And I want you to think for just a moment of any barriers that you might have to just beginning by expressing caring to this person that you've hurt. I want you to reflect on that for a moment. And you're welcome to write down a word or two about that if you'd care to. Any difficulties, any challenges to expressing caring, even if it's nonverbal, which can be in a glance or in an openness of the heart as that manifests even in the space between. I'll tell you what came up in the group around this one. Ingredient number 1 is another individual said, it can be very hard to express caring when I'm worried about admitting that I'm wrong. The inference being that it's too vulnerable to go down that road to admit that I'm wrong. And so this individual was saying, and I can certainly relate to this, and maybe you can too, of where more tender feelings of caring for the other, they're walled off right from the get-go. That is, to open into feeling, to express that is to open into where we're headed with this, which is to apologize. And if that feels too risky, then I dare not risk tenderness towards you or caring towards you. So that's one example of a challenge to just beginning by expressing caring. And then we ask what would be the possible benefit of that. And I think the benefit of each one of these stages will be somewhat self-evident, but let's just state it explicitly, is that when you've harmed somebody, to express caring, whether it's in the tone of your voice or in the look of your eye, is already creating a bridge towards healing or mending the break or the rupture that's happened. And so to start as the premise is that I care about you, I wouldn't want to harm you because I do love you, I do care about you. That communication, even if it's nonverbal, is a very powerful premise for all that follows. Okay, ingredient number 2. I call this legitimize, and that is in our apology that we legitimize the other person's reaction, their experience of being hurt or harmed by what we've said or done. Another term for this sometimes is validation, to validate their experience. And just to give an example of how that would go, would be to say, you have every right to be angry or hurt by what I said or by what I did. It's just to legitimize their perspective. Let me ask you about this one. Can you imagine any challenges to your legitimizing the other person's experience as part of the apology? And this would probably be made verbally. This probably would need to be stated. Really understand why you're upset. Or something like that would have hurt my feelings too if you'd done that to me. I'll give you an example of how it went today in the exercise. Is we actually did a role play in our group, and there was a female member that joined our group today. It's typically a men's group, but she wanted to join the group today, so I allowed her to join. And so she and I were role-playing an opportunity for an apology. I was the one apologizing to her. And she actually role-played, making it really difficult. She upped the ante, and it can certainly go this way in relationship. I'm not saying it can't. But by my legitimizing her, it came right at this juncture when I legitimized her feelings, her concern, her reaction, she began to amp it up even further and to come after me, basically. And so I would say one challenge to legitimizing another person's experience is to trust that they're not going to turn that against you. I would say as a counter to that, and this would be a benefit that's inherent in this particular ingredient, is that to legitimize or validate or mirror another person's experience most often will calm the waters. Most often will settle them down, because back to what Sue Johnson said about these ruptures is that most often they're made worse by the fact that there isn't a legitimization or a validation going on. How did she put it? It's the inability to keep others' feelings or perspective in mind when it really matters. This is what can be so injurious in relationships. And in this case of legitimizing, what I'm doing is I'm very much holding you in mind and your experience in mind, and I'm communicating that to you. So the benefit, again, is bridge building. The third ingredient, owning your responsibility. So I've started off by expressing caring for you. I care about you. I've legitimized your experience. I can understand why you're upset. And now I'm going to own my responsibility, and that's simply, I did what you said. I did that. I did that to you, or I said that to you. It's owning that. As another member of the group said today, the challenge here is that it's so much easier to either minimize or even evade responsibility. We talked about denial, how it is we can just deny it ever happened. That would be the opposite extreme of owning your responsibility for what you've done. And here you're really staking a claim and making yourself vulnerable, because you're not skittering away. You're actually stopping and taking full responsibility for what you did. And that's really what this third ingredient is. One of the things that can happen in a relationship that can be so upsetting is the other person brings a concern or a complaint, or it brings to mind brings to surface a problem that's arisen, and to have the other person deny it, for some people will go into, I've heard people say it makes them feel crazy. They doubt their own experience because there's no ownership of the other person. The other person is denying responsibility. And this is a way to effectively stop that feeling of going crazy or doubting your own experience, because the other person is absolutely taking responsibility and owning up to whatever it is that you're saying they did. So it's a really key piece of an effective apology. Let me pause here and say something while I'm thinking of it, is that even though I'm laying out 6 different dimensions of an effective apology, it's not to say these go in order. It's not to say all of them will happen in every apology. But what we're doing is that we're amplifying or unpacking the elements of an apology to understand the complexity involved and understand what may be missing. In fact, I'm thinking right now of another individual in group today who said, we were about at this point, we're about halfway through, and he said, I'm realizing as we go through this is that I've never made an apology that includes these components. And if any part of that's true for you, or even any component, any ingredient has been missing for you, that'll be something for you to make a mental note of and to accentuate, draw to the top of your attention, so that in the future when you make an apology, that you don't operate with certain blind spots. The fourth ingredient. The fourth ingredient I'm calling expressing rightful guilt. We've spent a lot of time in several of our previous podcasts focusing on shame and its distinction from guilt. Shame being the sense that I've not only done something wrong, but I'm something bad for having done it. Guilt owns up to having done something, feels bad about doing it, but it doesn't make me the doer. It doesn't make me defective or fundamentally broken or wrong or bad. It just means I've got to not do that again. I've got to feel bad about it to stop doing it. Guilt is a very important feedback mechanism. Shame actually ends up paralyzing us and shutting us down. So in the vein of previous conversations about shame and guilt, we're talking about expressing rightful guilt. And what that might look like is this. I feel really bad for having hurt your feelings. The focus is on my experience, and I'm expressing remorse or sorrow, and you can feel that. You can sense the authenticity of that. Now, why this is important is that if I don't feel bad about it, what's to say I wouldn't do it again? And so guilt is not only an indicator to me of something that I need to not repeat, it's also a communication to you that I intend not to repeat it because I feel bad about it. Can you think of barriers in your own experience to expressing rightful guilt? I can think of one right now. If I express guilt to you to say, I feel really bad about having said that or having done that, what happens if you look at me and you go, well, you should feel bad? How about if we even amp it up a bit and say, not only should you feel bad, but you suck. You are bad. You are broken. And that's the risk of all of this. The risk of making an apology is that we're making ourselves vulnerable. There's an interesting conversation today in the group because we had one female in the group that's typically of men. And she contributed a lot to today's group in talking about, she put it this way. She says, she generalized about women and men. And she says, women tend to lead with their feelings. Men tend to lead with their thinking. And I said, generally, there's some truth to that. And so she continued on to say, what women want from men is an apology if they've hurt them. And I looked at the men in the group and I said, and this is the tricky part, is that we men have been socialized from day one, and we men aren't alone because plenty of women have been socialized similarly. But I can certainly speak for men being socialized to be so-called strong, which is any vulnerable emotion like sadness, and certainly like remorse or apology, exposes our soft underbelly and actually exposes us to being weak. And so vulnerability equals weakness. Hence, I'm not going to go there as a man. I'm just going to be strong. And so my range of emotions includes a very short menu, primarily of anger, and certainly not of softness and admission of wrong. So this fourth step, this fourth ingredient of expressing rightful guilt runs smack dab up against a lot of our socialization, whether it's gender-based, whether it's in our families or in our subculture, and it certainly stands in the way of laying down arms and making ourselves vulnerable. As I said earlier, the benefit of it is huge, because now there's an indication that I feel bad about it, which suggests that I would like to correct this. I think the next ingredient number 5, gets at this even more deeply in terms of moving towards mending a breach in the relationship. Ingredient number 5 is this: it's to express upset at seeing the pain of the one who's been wronged. It might look something like this. It's extremely painful for me to see that I've done something that caused you so much suffering. And so this I'm sorry includes I'm sorry to have caused you suffering. So you begin to get the depth and the nuance of the kind of apology that we're talking about right here. I am so sorry for having hurt you. Can you imagine into possible challenges in your communicating this? It reminds me just now of what we spoke of a few minutes ago, is for me to say that I'm sorry. I have this crazy image that's come back. It's a memory I have from, I think it's about 50 years ago. Yeah, it's about 50 years ago. I was with my uncle in Texas, and we were throwing a baseball back and forth. And he had a better aim than I. I was about 12 or 13. And about one of every 2 or 3 throws, I'd throw it over his head or off to the side. And I kept saying to Uncle Max, I'm sorry. And at some point he said to me, I love this uncle so much. He said to me, yes, you are sorry, Bobby. And I think that gets at, in a humorous way, the vulnerability involved in apologizing. I'm not saying that that was a great apology. And I'm not saying his response was necessarily a great response, but I loved him. And there was good nature in his sharing back with me that I should be sorry, or that I was sorry. That's a Texanism. You are sorry, which can be used really critically. I don't believe he was using it that way overtly that day. But to make myself vulnerable, to apologize, is to expose myself to the other person's increasing recrimination. And if I expressed to you how upset I am by having hurt you, you could respond by saying, well, if you know that, why'd you do it in the first place? And the whole thing kind of grinds to a halt. And so what we're hoping here is that all that's led up to this in the previous 4 ingredients, and now this 5th ingredient, is that there's an openness, of vulnerability, and authenticity, a genuine spirit of wanting to extend an olive branch and opening ourselves up, that there'll be less likelihood of that person aggressing against us. And I think the spirit in which we express an apology will communicate a lot. And the benefit of this one, as I implied earlier, is very much connected to the 4th ingredient. That is, if I am upset not only that I did this, but also that I harmed you, then that is a huge step in the direction of not only wanting to bridge between us, but also points in the direction to the future of my intention of not wanting to do that again. And that brings us to the 6th and final ingredient of this particular way of understanding apology, and that is that I want to reassure you about the future. And so what would follow on the previous, if I say I'm really, really upset by how much pain I've caused you, the very next piece is, and I intend never to do that again. So this really requires a change in me. In fact, I asked the group today, at the very beginning, what goes into an effective apology? And the very first response was this: it's not doing something wrong to begin with. I think it was more like to do the right thing. And at first I cast that aside. I didn't get it. And then I sat there for a minute and I thought, no, we'll come back to that. And we did, and it fits right here under ingredient number 6. Is that reassuring about the future is a commitment to doing the right thing. It's a commitment to not repeating the offense that led to this apology. And I think that's implied. I think there's a lot of parts of an apology that are important, but I think it's not enough I think it's very important to mirror the other person's experience or acknowledge it, legitimize it, and to own up to our responsibility for that, and to express feeling both about our own behavior and its impact on the other. But it's not enough to leave it there. In a sense, that would be cheap grace. And what we're looking for is an authentic apology that has to include the intention of not repeating this, of doing right by this person. And so that's key. Now, what would be any possible barriers to that for you? Think about that for a second. If in an apology you said, I'm really sorry and I don't plan to, I want to make sure that doesn't happen again. I don't plan to repeat that. One of the members of the group today said talk is cheap, and it is, and an apology can be used as a manipulation. We're going to talk about some ineffective styles or types of apology in just a few moments, but here we're talking about making a commitment, and that may be a barrier, that may be a challenge. What if I don't know if I can really promise that I'm not going to do that again? Maybe the intention here is less on promising something that we don't have absolute foreknowledge of than it is to communicate a clear intention to clean up our act, to not repeat the wrong done. And that if that's expressed sincerely, and if there's follow-through on that, it seems to me that that's critical. And there's an opportunity to communicate that. And I'll guarantee you, in terms of kind of closing the loop on an apology, this piece is as important as the previous 5 ingredients for sure. And in some ways the most important. Everything else leads up to not only am I sorry for what I did, but I want to commit to you out of my love for you not to repeat this. If you've noticed at all in terms of these barriers or challenges to an apology, there's one theme that runs through all of them, and we've already talked about it, and it's shame. It's really challenging for me to open my heart to you and acknowledge I've done something wrong if that's the unspeakable. If I can't possibly be close consciously to my doing wrong, because that immediately transfers into my somehow being wrong, then I dare not go there. Now, shame can lead us to defensive responses, and I do want to talk for a moment or two, just to kind of keep this real and balanced, at some ineffective forms of apology. I'm going to call these token apologies. Specifically, I'm going to talk about 4 token forms of apology. I'm going to ask you to do this now. As I go through each one of these, I'm going to pause. I'm going to ask you to record your own example of a time that you've executed one of these token apologies. I certainly have numerous times. It'd be more accurate to say innumerable times. So not only do I want you to record an example for each one of these, but I'll help talk us through the challenges that arise oftentimes around shame that keep us from really opening into a real apology. And then the consequences of that, the consequences of acting out a token apology, because it can be very costly. Okay, so for the first example of a token apology, this was actually generated from the group today as I asked about ways that apologies don't go well. We called it a drive-by apology. And here today I'm calling it a token apology in the form of an exit strategy. What I mean by that is this would be the briefest of apologies, like, I'm so sorry, and then just walk on. In other words, there's not, you remember how I talked about nonverbal or body language? There's no engagement in this kind of apology. It really is a drive-by. And it can be one way to defend against being vulnerable is I can literally say the words empty of any feeling content. And that would be the quick apology that just wants to get in and out and leave this behind. Think about a time that you've given an exit apology or a drive-by apology. Think of what motivated that. To actually sit with an apology and to drop into these 6 different forms of an effective apology requires our, first of all, opening up ourselves to ourselves. And if I'm in shame, that's difficult to do. And then it's to risk crossing over to you with the possibility that you're going to shame me or blame me as well. So it's really a dicey proposition. And yet there's no other way to reconcile in a relationship in terms of wrongs committed unless one person is willing and able to make an effective apology and the other person to extend the right hand of forgiveness. And so an exit apology removes that possibility of a healing, of a bridging. A second example of an apology that's ineffective, or a token apology, is a minimizing apology. You can move the slides forward. In a minimizing apology, this is where we downplay the other person's experience. And so let me see if I can think of an example. I'm sorry, but I don't see what the big deal was. And so the expression of apology is coupled with a minimizing of your experience. And do you see how right away we're violating the second ingredient of an effective apology? Rather than legitimizing your experience, I'm minimizing your experience. And so basically it's 1 step forward and 2 steps backwards. Won't be effective either. Can you think of a time that you've done that? Maybe you can think of a time that that's been done to you, where somebody's apologized to you but minimized the offense at the same time. And why do we do that? It may be too painful to admit that we were responsible for that. We may be too worried about the other person's getting inflamed, so if we can minimize it, maybe that will contain it. In any case, it's an ineffective form of apology. There's a third form of token apology, and this is a forced apology. And actually somebody mentioned this today in the group before I brought it up. And that would go something like this. Okay, if you need me to apologize, okay, I'll apologize. I'm sorry. I call it gun-to-head apology. It's the only reason I'm apologizing is to get you off my case. And there's no vulnerability, there's no heart in that. It's a hollow or empty apology for sure. Can you think of a time that you've done that just to get somebody off your case? Imagine what that felt like to them. Or if you've been on the receiving end of that. I can think of times I've been on the receiving end of that, and I do get angry with that. Be better not to even voice an attempted apology than to say, oh, if you need me to do this, I'll do it. It feels condescending. And the fourth example I have of a token apology is related to a forced apology. This one is, I call an instrumental apology, and this is the apology that I'm basically apologizing as a means to an end. Okay, if we're going to have dinner tonight, it's going to require me having me apologizing, so I'm sorry. Or if we're not going to have a miserable evening, I guess I better apologize. I'm sorry. An apology to be effective needs to be an end in and of itself, and it needs not to be instrumental to some other goal or end. Otherwise, the person feels unheard or unresponded to. It's not really taken seriously. My guess is you can relate to all 4 of those token forms of apology. I certainly can. And now the trick is to develop these skills to where they become more and more reflexive in relationship. I think the start is to be exposed to this material. I think some of it will require you reflecting on this, further journaling on your own, and trial and error in relationship. But I would recommend you to that trial and error because I think it can make a big difference. You know, I want to go back to an earlier slide where I mentioned that stress is the #1 trigger for relapse. And one of the most stressful things, as we've talked about all along, is relational friction. disagreement or disruption in our relationships. And what we're suggesting here is that you can actually do something to mend ruptures. We've broken down apology into 6 different components, and in some ways it's artificial. It reminds me a little bit of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's Stages of Death and Dying. Very, very useful, really pioneering work that she did working with grief around the dying process and the loss, the bereavement, the loss of people that are valuable in our lives. But she was clear about this, that this just didn't follow stages. And in fact, she picked 5 stages of grief, and that's arbitrary. Well, so are 6 ingredients or steps or stages of apology. But it begins, I think, to open up the complexity of this. And I hope, if for nothing else, you've been able to identify where it is that you may need to work, where an area for your own growth would aid you in mending relationships. I want to encourage you to that end in practicing it. And my guess is the holidays may provide an opportunity. As we're rubbing shoulders with people that are close to us in our lives, there'll be opportunities to apologize, either for things that are happening in the moment or for possibly there's a chance to make amends for things that have happened in the past. And I'd encourage you to review these steps to where you get them in enough internal that you can make sure that you're slowing down and not doing a drive-by, that you're not minimizing, rather you're legitimizing the other person's experience, owning up to what you've done, expressing genuine remorse and sorrow, communicating love all the way through this for the individual, including your horror or your upset at having caused them pain, and reassuring them that you sincerely wish to change and don't intend to repeat the harm. I'd love to know how this goes for you as you experience this. One of the things that any of us that have worked in the 12-step programs will know is that a key trigger for relapse that's identified in the 12-step programs is resentment. And really what we're talking about doing is finding a way to kind of surgically excise resentment from our relationships in real time. An apology well executed and well responded to puts resentment to rest. And that's really a key here, because we were talking about this today, how it is that when you don't have any means for making amends and forgiving in a relationship, the example I gave is it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's not necessarily the single stab wound that kills. It's repeated minor ruptures, these ruptures in relationship, these attachment injuries that go unacknowledged and unforgiven. They begin to build up, and over time they build up to where the relationship manifests with, as I said earlier, more and more emotional reactivity, and I mean negative reactivity, and or more and more emotional distance to keep the resentment kind of under wraps. And it's the death of a relationship. You'll end up with a relationship of 2 people that have no feeling for each other. I mentioned this earlier, that Sigmund Freud, the founder of modern psychoanalysis, said that repression is non-selective. And by that, if I attempt to repress my resentment at you for not apologizing, or you do the same towards me, that repression of the resentment ends up affecting even positive feelings such as love and tenderness, is that over time that will get more and more numbed out to where all you have in a relationship are 2 ships passing in the night. And so what we're talking about here is another effective means for healing resentment and liberating relationship to be full-bodied and full-feeling. Another resource that I mentioned, next slide, another resource that I mentioned last week, and I'll mention it again because it focuses so much on this, is the recent CD that I created with Doug Prater with musical background. And it's also a downloadable audio file where I take you through various steps of the forgiveness process. And it mirrors or parallels a lot of what we've talked about today in terms of asking others for forgiveness involves making an apology to them. And offering to forgive others, particularly to reconcile with others, means accepting their apology. And there's a way, even when you think about self-compassion, is that we may apologize to ourselves. I certainly have in my own meditations, apologize to ourselves for things that we've done to our truest, deepest selves that have been injurious to them, and to apologize for that. And this particular resource, The Freedom of Forgiveness, discusses, in a meditative context, discusses a lot of what we've covered in our previous discussions of forgiveness and shame and reconciliation, and today talking about apologizing and making amends. And so I recommend you to that. You can find that at my website, www.drbobweathers.com. I recommend you to that resource as well. Be a nice holiday gift to yourself. Okay, well, I wish you well with this. I'd be very interested in hearing how this goes for you. I encourage you to respond on our Facebook site, Ask an Addiction Specialist, with any thoughts, questions, hopefully successes, but also any stumblings. I'm happy to respond to you. You're also welcome to write me through my website, drbobweathers.com. You can write me there as well. I'd be very interested to see how this works for you and help to refine this with you as well, too. A quick peek at next week's topic, and we'll be done for the day. Next week, we're going to be looking at practicing self-observation. And specifically, I'll be introducing you to what's referred to as insight meditation, and a way for us to be able to step one step back in our lives, look at ourselves more objectively in a way that also helps to reduce stress and help us to gain perspective on our lives. And so I'd love for you to join me next week in another holiday presentation on stress management and reduction, okay? Thank you so much for joining us today. I wish you well. I want to thank Austin and Franz again for co-producing. You're a great team. And come join us next week for Ask an Addiction Specialist. Thanks so much for being with us today. Blessings to you.